Hi, I'm Connor Burke with Excel6 Solutions, and I want to go over the top 10 most common issues we see in warehouse deployments, as well as some of the best solutions for those problems, and then some real-world examples. The number one issue that we typically see in our warehouse deployments is that there are extremely high ceilings, and people try to place Omnis on those ceilings at the 45 or 50 feet sometimes. Most of those Omnis are not designed to do that. They do have some down tilt with them, but they are not designed to drop down to 40 or 50 feet. They're made for the 15, 20-foot ceilings that you'll see. So the main issue that we see is that you need to use a directional antenna to actually cover those aisles or those open palletized areas, because that has the power to actually reach down to those. The second most common issue that we see is that it's a very dynamic environment in a lot of these warehouses. Not nearly as dynamic as this environment with everything crashing. It is usually a planned dynamicness to where you're either having inventory change just based on the levels of it shipping in and out, as well as your forklifts going through it. All this affects your environment as you're trying to design it. It's not going to be how you think it is when you actually implement it. And on that, there is also just a ton of metal in there. You both have the metal of the racks, the metal of your product, depending on what you have, the metal of the forklifts. All this is a very reflective surface, and you're going to see a lot of noise just based on that being there. So you need to really not necessarily take into account, but be aware that that's going to be there and have to measure that in your specific environment. Co-channel interference, as of 5 gigahertz being more implemented now in hand scanners in these warehouses, hasn't been as much of an issue, but there still is a lot of legacy scanners out there that still use 2.4, and you really have to take into consideration using just those 3 channels and making sure that you're not going to have any bleed over into adjacent aisles or bleed out to where it's going into the more open areas. So you need to make sure that you're keeping all your aisles very isolated and not having any co-channel interference from bleeding over into them. The next thing we see is that people have a lot of goals and aspirations for their antennas, but it does not always turn out that way. You can have the correct antenna for a deployment, but if you expect that one antenna to cover a 900-foot aisle or cover the entire warehouse by itself, that's not going to happen. You need to be very much more realistic in how you actually expect these antennas to perform, along with picking the right one from the start. And then mounting is the other issue that we see a lot of times, because again, you can have the right antenna, you can know where it's need to be used, you know how many to use them, and have it actually covering the right area. But if you don't know how to actually get it up into the rafters or onto the wall, however you're deploying it, then it doesn't really do you a lot of good. It's just sitting on the ground. So figuring out how to actually mount it to the ceiling along with your AP in a usable way to where you can still see your LED lights and not be able to hit it with a forklift, that's a big issue that we see come up until you find the correct mount for you. And the last thing you really need to do is, no matter how good your design is, no matter how accurate you think it is, it's always good to do a site survey of your actual site. As I kind of mentioned earlier with the specific metals and the racking, it's all going to be different for your specific location, so you really need to go in and verify for it. You can't just assume that it's going to be like every other location. Everything's going to have its own unique problems and challenges that you need to address at that location. So now I'd like to go over some of the general use cases that we have seen, as well as some specific use cases like this one here. So this one was for a pet supply store that needed an antenna to cover multiple aisles as well as single aisles for their constantly changing racking situation. Because not only did they have different levels of inventory in them, from dog food to dog toys, the racks themselves would actually shift left to right depending on how much inventory they had. So the entire warehouse was constantly in a state of flux, just changing all over the place. So what we had to do for them was create an antenna that was a little bit wider on the vertical and the extremely wide on the horizontal, so 115 by 125 beamless. And what that allowed it to do was still be able to cover the single aisle, but if you were to shift it over 5 feet, it would still stay within that aisle and still be able to cover the whole thing. But the main thing that I wanted to be able to show with y'all here is that the level of inventory makes a drastic difference. So you can see on the left, we're showing specifically the 2.4, and you can see when the inventory is full on the left 2.4 image, it stays within its aisle, it has a little bleed over. But when you get it to where you're having either less dense inventory or just less inventory in general, it bleeds out to 3 or 4 adjacent aisles, and that can cause a lot of issues you're seeing in your system, especially when we were doing this one and they were using 2.4 hand scanners. You'll see a lot of co-channel interference and a lot of noise from having all these APs stacked on top of each other and bleeding over. And you can see it again with the 5 gigahertz, a little bit less so just because it attenuates more through the less dense inventory still, but it is still an issue that you need to take into consideration if you're having pillows or dog beds versus dog food or canned wet food. It's going to make a large difference in your actual inventory levels. So the issue that I would like to address also that comes up a lot is why not Omnis? So we kind of addressed this earlier with the ceiling height factor. The top Omni you see there, that's more of a true Omni. It's a donut-shaped pattern. It's almost completely dedicated to the horizontal plane. It has almost no down tilt to it. Most of your internal Omnis you'll see do have some amount of down tilt to them. That's going to depend on your vendor-to-vendor application. They're all going to be slightly different. But even with those, they're not designed to go down the 30 or 45 feet that we mentioned before. Whereas if you look down below that, that is what we call our warehouse antenna. It's a high gain, 8 dBi, made to go up and down the length of the aisle, and the 3D propagation gives you a really good view of that. You can see how that wedge could almost run down the entire length of the aisle. And for instance, that specific one there, if you're looking at the antenna, the long beam width would go this way along the antenna, so you would orient it to where the leads are going parallel to the aisle, and then your little narrow beam width goes between the two sides here and stays within the aisle without that much of a bleed over. So you can see that that's really made for those high rack, high ceiling deployments that you have really long aisles for. And we'll see specifically here that it can save you a lot on your AP costs. So the very center AP there you see the one in red. That is an internal Omni AP. We turned the racks to 25 feet along with the ceiling and turned the attenuation up on those all the way just so they wouldn't bleed over for now. But you can see that it really doesn't cover that far in that one aisle. It has a lot of issues. And then on the left side, we have one of our APs and antennas stacked to the wall. We used to see this a lot. It has become less common. And the main reason is while this does give a good coverage throughout your aisle, you can see that it's not very symmetrical. The one end of the aisle has neg 50 coverage, and the other end of the aisle is getting neg 67. And beyond that, if you start getting to where you're having a lot of people in that aisle, either doing picking or grabbing product from the shelves, as well as forklifts going up and down that aisle, that's going to significantly impact your performance on the far side of the aisle. So the way that we see most people get around this now is that they do a center aisle deployment flush to the ceiling. And this allows you to get consistent coverage throughout the whole aisle. It doesn't matter if you're running around the aisles with multiple employees or if you're driving a forklift, you're still going to see great coverage on either side of the aisle without anything really causing interference. And this for your more open palletized areas. These areas are where you could debate if you're going to use some Omnis, because sometimes you can drop these a little bit lower from the ceiling and not have to worry about the forklift because they are just floor pallets. Or you could even mount them to the wall and be able to use an L bracket or just wall mount them and can still get good coverage. But we typically see that it's easier just to do a ceiling mount like you have with the other warehouse antennas, use a directional antenna and cover those palletized areas much simpler and without much hassle and having to worry about constantly hitting them if you are driving a forklift around in that area. Thank you for your time. If you'd like to speak to anyone at Exceltex, please contact the information below. Thank you.